Citizenfour is the latest documentary from renowned filmmaker Laura Poitras. The Oscar-nominated film is largely a portrait of Edward Snowden, the National Security Agency contractor who teamed up with Poitras and journalist Glenn Greenwald to blow the whistle on electronic surveillance by the United States and its allies. I recently caught up with Poitras and learned that Edward Snowden wasn't originally meant to be the focus of Citizenfour. Before she'd ever heard of Edward Snowden, Laura Poitras was already working on a documentary about U.S. government surveillance. But the film changed when she received an anonymous email.
I am a senior government employee in the intelligence community. I hope you understand that contacting you is extremely high risk. I ask only that you ensure this information makes it home to the American public. Thank you, and be careful. Citizenfour.
In the first part of our conversation, I asked Poitras if she was suspicious of the person who was sending the emails.
At first I knew that if it was legitimate, that it was going to be dangerous for the source, and that I had to be really careful with communicating. And then I also had questions for the person. I wanted to make sure it wasn't a form of entrapment. And so I asked back, why are you contacting me?
And you literally said, are you trying to trick me?
Yeah, I said, how do I know this isn't entrapment? How do I know you're for real? How do I know you're not crazy? And why are you contacting me? Were the questions.
And your concern there was for your other sources, for other people that you communicate with, that you
in terms of entrapment?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, I was put on a U.S. government watch list, and I was stopped for many years. So I thought, well, I could potentially be a target of entrapment, but I thought that was probably more, or that would be less likely, but maybe sort of through me to try to entrap other people.
And was there a specific email or a specific moment where you kind of knew this was a big deal, like how big a deal this might be?
Yeah, in the film you see there's a scene where the NSA Utah data center is being built, and there's a long email where he's talking about, you know, listing off many things and say, this I can prove, this I can prove, this I can prove. And it was that email that I, you know, went into a different gear. You know, I had a different computer that I bought to communicate with him.
I saw it somewhere that you said you were psychologically and emotionally pulled in by this exchange with this unknown person. Can you describe that? What was that about?
Well, I mean, you see, I mean, people talk about the film sometimes and they describe it as sort of a bit of a mystery. And that's what it felt like. I mean, I started receiving anonymous emails from a mysterious person who I didn't know who he was and I didn't know where he worked, and who was making claims that were quite shocking. And so, yeah, I mean, I was pulled into that. And then I also had a strong sense that if he turned out to be a legitimate source, that he was taking enormous personal risk.
In June of 2013, Laura Poitras and journalist Glenn Greenwald traveled to Hong Kong to meet their source.
My name is Edward Snowden. I go by Ed.
He wasn't what they expected. I asked Poitras how she made the decision to meet Snowden despite the risks. When did it become clear that you were going to get on a plane and fly somewhere and meet this person?
So, I mean, there were many things happened. So first I learned that he didn't intend to remain anonymous. And that's when I realized that I really wanted to meet him, because he was going to come forward with his identity anyway, and that I felt it was important that he articulate why he was doing that. So I asked him if that was possible, and you know, we had a long back and forth about it. And he was concerned for. He didn't want the issue to be about him, so his initial response to meeting and me bringing a camera was no. And he also was concerned that it would be risky for us. But once I sort of convinced him that it was important, and that he would become part of the story, you know, once his documents came forward, he agreed. And he also, you know, he had told me early on that the material was going to be more than one person could report on, that I should work with other people.
And did you at any point feel as though Snowden was naive about what this might mean? In other words, when he said, I want to come forward, and you said you don't need to, or was there a moment where you kind of felt like you don't know what you're getting yourself into?
I don't actually think so. I think he actually understood that he was taking pretty enormous risks, you know. I think that was pretty clear. He knew that for him, that the consequences, you know, could be very bad.
And you were taking a risk too. Did it feel that way as this was all unfolding?
Sure. I mean, you know, we knew, you know, both Glenn and I, that, you know, we were going to be reporting on things that the U.S. government was going to be angry about. You know, we both Glenn and I had been doing reporting about the NSA, and know what the government has been doing in terms of coming down on journalists and whistleblowers and sources.
Even with what you knew, were you surprised by what you found out? By what Edward Snowden had to share?
Like no one had ever come forward with this kind of information. I mean, it's staggering what the extent to which they are trying to collect so much information. You know, not on people who are suspected of certain things, but shifting their model to just sort of try to ingest as much as possible. And so the communications of people who are suspected of nothing being taken in by the NSA.
When you did finally meet him, what was your impression of him?
You know, Glenn and I both talked about this. We were both taken aback that we met somebody so young. We'd kind of created an image of who we thought we were going to meet, and we thought we were going to meet somebody who was higher up in the government. And so that was a surprise.
Did it make you nervous?
It didn't make us nervous. It was just more like, it was more, you know, you go in with certain expectations and it's like something that was like completely different than what we'd expected. So it was more just about readjusting to that. And then in retrospect, it makes a lot of sense, you know, given the fact that he's sort of the generation, sort of on the cusp of, you know, of seeing like growing up with the internet and then seeing it becoming more commercialized, more militarized, more surveilled, and remembering a time when that was not the case.
Edward Snowden put himself and his loved ones at risk to share information about NSA surveillance with journalists. I asked Poitras why she thinks Snowden was motivated to do what he did.
I think the most fundamental thing was that he thinks that policies of this magnitude should not be made in secret in a democracy. That these were policies that impacted everyone, and that they were happening behind closed doors, and that the American people and the citizens more broadly should have a voice in these tools that have so much power. And I think that's the basic thing. And I also think he's sort of an idealist in the sense that he believes in the Constitution, and he felt that these were violations of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, we have a Fourth Amendment that protects our communication, our privacy, and I think that he felt that was being violated by the programs.
Were you struck by his demeanor? From the very beginning, he comes across as very calm and very articulate.
Yeah, I mean, he's incredibly articulate. I mean, it's not just that we've edited the film to pick those moments where he's, you know, speaks very eloquently. He does that all the time. I mean, this was a case of someone who he hadn't done a single interview with a single media ever, you know. So he's coming in completely new at what was happening, and so it was quite impressive. And you know, in retrospect, I mean, I think he'd thought about this decision for a long time, you know, and whether or not it's worth taking the risk that he was taking. So I think that was, you know, his thinking kind of came through.
He must have known one way or another his life would never be the same. Did he, in the hotel room, was there a growing awareness on his part of how it would never be the same? That he was exiled, that he would never see some people again, that...
I mean, I think in a situation like this, like, you know, I think he understood that there was no turning back, obviously. But there's a difference between understanding that in an abstract way and actually experiencing it. And I think what you see in the film is sort of the moment when his partner, Lindsay Mills, is visited by the NSA, then you realize that it's not just I'm taking a risk, but the people that he cares about, there's going to be consequences for them. And you know, you see that happening, you know, with him. And I think that's something that you can't ever predict how it's going to feel and what it's going to be like.
Edward Snowden faced the wrath of the U.S. government for leaking classified secrets about electronic surveillance. In her Oscar-nominated documentary, Citizenfour, director Laura Poitras followed Snowden as he experiences the early consequences of his actions. Citizenfour captures tense personal moments in Edward Snowden's Hong Kong hotel room as the U.S. government started investigating who leaked top-secret information about NSA surveillance. I asked Laura Poitras what it was like to film Snowden as his life changed forever.
In that situation, what I'm trying to do is to to document these emotions so that I can, communicate what's happening. And, in this situation, it was there's a lot of subtleties. I mean, here's somebody who's on typing on a computer, and so you don't actually have the other person there, but like there was a lot of, palpable emotion. And so I wanted to show that, because I knew that this was really hard for him. That like the impact on not just Lindsay but on his family were the things that he was, really, really most concerned about. I don't think he was as concerned about the risk for himself as he was what would happen to his family and what would happen to her, and that he had made that, the choice, like that he felt that these issues were important enough to make those risks those personal risks, and also put other people, through something that he knew was going to be really hard.
One thing that comes across that you couldn't have anticipated, but seems actually to be very genuine, is that he didn't want to be the story. There was no sense of grandstanding or ego in what he was doing. It might have been a very different film if he were less likable. Were you surprised at how likable you found him?
At first, it was, the shock of how young he was, and then I wasn't so much thinking, like, I was really kind of in the situation. I was more worried about what happens if we get raided and how am I going to keep the footage safe. I wasn't really, like, all that kind of reflection, came sort of after the fact when we were in the editing room. Like, in the moment, it felt really, that these were really high-stakes situation, and that I was just trying to document what was in front of me, and make sure that, if, for instance, we were raided, that I had backed up everything and gotten it out of the hotel room. And I was worried about more of those things rather than thinking, isn't it great that he's charismatic?
So with the sense that at any time, the door could be bashed in, what was the sense of urgency to get it out? Because once it's out, it's a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bit of a time clock, right? I mean, like I said, he had left the country. When you work for the NSA, if you travel internationally, it's something that you're supposed to notify supervisors, and he hadn't done that in this case. So there was a sense that we knew that it wouldn't take long for the government to start to ask questions, and that we wanted to publish as quickly as possible. And that we had a limited time to work together. That it wasn't going to be infinite amount of time, and so there was a pressure to report, and then also go through as many of the documents and talk about the issues, because he was, he's an expert in what is highly complicated and technical information.
Just a few days after meeting with Edward Snowden for the first time, journalist Glenn Greenwald publishes his first story about NSA surveillance. It revealed that the NSA was tracking the phone calls of millions of Verizon customers and ignited a media firestorm.
It's sweeping. It's a government program designed to collect information about all Americans, not just people where they believe there's reason to think they've done anything wrong.
I asked Poitras how it felt to be in the room as the world learned about Snowden's secret files.
I mean, we were in a bit of a bubble in the hotel room, and not knowing what kind of impact it would have. And so when the first story went out, I think we were all surprised by how fast it sort of spread everywhere. And the first story was Glenn's story about the secret court Verizon document that showed that the NSA was collecting the phone records of all U.S. citizens domestically. And this was something that we had, the public had no idea was happening. I mean, these were things that were happening in secret, that the government was using secret interpretations of the Patriot Act to authorize it, and it went everywhere.
One of the amazing things in the film was that footage of senior officials testifying in what we know, because of Edward Snowden, are either lies or kind of great negligence. I suppose we can debate which it is. Are you personally shocked by that?
I mean, I guess the answer is yes and no, right? I mean, it's not the first time that the government has not been truthful about what they're doing. I mean, so that's not that shocking. But yeah, I mean, there was a kind of blatantness to the lying that was a bit shocking in retrospect. I mean, so in the film, before we arrive in Hong Kong, what we wanted to do was sort of set the stage, like what was happening, how whistleblowers were being targeted, and how the government was lying, and how the government was trying to use things like state secrets privilege to hinder judicial oversight. Those have been, that was kind of the playbook. Like the government would, anyone try to bring a legal case, they would say, well, you can't bring this legal case because then to do so we would have to talk about state secrets, and therefore you can't even sue. And the most egregious case of this is somebody who was rendered, sent to a black site, tortured, and then the government acknowledges that was the wrong person. It was just like the wrong name, and when he tried to sue the US government, he couldn't bring a lawsuit because the government said for us to go into court, we'd have to talk about things that would, cross into state secrets. And so, that's a pretty disturbing context.
Does it frustrate you when you encounter the view that Edward Snowden is a traitor?
Here, it depends what people are saying to base that on. If people are going like fabricated narratives, like that he was an agent for another country, that's a fabrication. So I'm frustrated if people are fabricating information. If people are based on what they know of the facts, reach that conclusion, then that's their, they can reach that conclusion. So long as it's based on the facts, not on, fabrication of things. So, yeah, and that people have the right. The same thing, Daniel Ellsberg, when he came forward with the Pentagon Papers, he was also labeled a traitor, and now he's widely recognized as a whistleblower.
I'm going to imagine that you're glad on some level that Edward Snowden did what he did, that you think it was the right thing for him to do.
I think it is. I really think that, we live in a democracy, and that, it's not like something that these kinds of decisions shouldn't happen in secret, and that, our elected officials should be accountable to citizens, and we should know what our government is doing. So I do think that, that he did something that was a public service, and I think history will reflect that.
How's his life now?
You see in the film, we revisit him at the end of the film, and he's been joined by Lindsay Mills. She chose to be with him, which is, really, I think, extraordinary, because I think it was obviously not easy for her, what she went through. And it seems, I think that since she's been there, I think that's been great for him. And I know that he doesn't regret having come forward, so I think he doesn't have any regrets about those choices.
It's hard to say, but what do you think will happen to Edward Snowden?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if another country came forward and offered asylum at some point. I'm not on his legal team, so I'm not in those conversations. And I'm pretty sure that, in history, people will look back and say that he gave us, that we're at a crossroads, that technology is outpacing what we're able to do in terms of democratic oversight.
Thanks.
Thank you.